Good morning and welcome to OAG's latest webinar, or good afternoon if you're in other parts of the world. I know we've got many regular listeners, so welcome back if that's you. And if you're joining us for the first time for the webinar, we're pleased to have you join us too. We run these webinars each month and aim to provide an update of where the aviation industry is as it recovers from the pandemic, drawing on OAG's wealth of industry data. As usual, we try to take a specific topic to look at in a bit more depth, and this month we're going to be looking at China and the role that it holds in recovery for all of us. We'll run through first of all some of the OAG data, and then we're going to be looking at the Chinese domestic market and particularly the Chinese international market. We know that prior to the pandemic, the Chinese outbound traveller market was becoming the largest international travel market in the world. And so we want to ask the question, does China hold the key to recovery for the industry as we move forward? Joining me today, we've got Zheng Lei from, you're in Australia, aren't you, Zheng, at the moment? I know we first met when you were based in the UK here, but it's good to have you with us. And Zheng's an expert in Chinese aviation. Good morning, Zheng.
Okay, good morning, Becca. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's good to have you with us, Zheng, and we're looking forward to all your expertise. And as usual, we've got John Grant, Senior Analyst at OAG. Good morning, John.
Hi, good morning, Becca. Thank you for having me.
So it's 8 a.m., John, in the UK where you are. Zheng, it's 7 p.m. in Australia. Very different conditions you're both living under at the moment. I believe, Zheng, it's pretty hot where you are, and you're restriction-free. And John, you're waking up to a lovely, cold, cloudy day in the UK with still plenty of restrictions.
Yeah, it feels like a Phil Collins song, doesn't it? Another day in paradise here. I wish I was with Zheng watching the tennis, but I'm sure that will come back at some time.
Yes, it's 32 degrees Celsius here, quite warm.
Quite 32 degrees. That's very nice for you. Okay, let's move on and start looking at some of the OAG data that we have. We've shown this type of information at the start of each of the webinars for getting on for a full year now. I think this is we've been going since March last year. John, this data is monthly data, so we're showing global airline capacity versus the same month last year, running through to February 21. And as we move through February, the February numbers will change because we know capacity is changing all the time at the moment. What's this telling us, John?
It's telling us we are stuck, Becca. We are waiting for vaccines to be distributed around the world and for infection rates to come down. I think no one probably could have expected or realized how bad the first quarter of this year is actually going to be in terms of capacity and indeed demand, which is lagging even further behind. It's extremely frustrating. If you just look at the bottom left-hand corner and you see the changes in seat capacity, then there is a consistent trend in Europe since November of more and more capacity cuts, and indeed, that's been going on since August, when we really expected the recovery to begin, when we were talking about COVID-19 this time last year. In Latin America, we're beginning to see another round of COVID infection and subsequent reductions in capacity. And of course, the Brazilian variant is another cause for concern and will impact capacity as we go forward there. So it's a really, really depressing picture for the first quarter. But we have to remember that, we did anticipate that the first half of the year was going to be difficult and that it was going to be taxing for airlines and that there would be stop-start moments. And that's generally how it's materialized. And we're desperate and we're all waiting for July, August, the holiday season, the pent-up demand that everyone talks about, the revenge spending, all of these positive elements that are getting more sound bites today. but have yet to translate into booking activity for the airlines.
It seems to me, I suppose, you know, we're in the UK, John, you and I, and we've got a pretty speedy vaccine rollout going ahead. And I suppose I naively assumed that once we had been vaccinated, we could all travel. But it seems to me that the countries that have got their case numbers down almost continue to put more lockdowns in place. You know, we were talking to Cheng just before we started the webinar, and they've just had a 5-day lockdown in Melbourne over a couple of cases, and Australia's not looking at opening borders possibly till the end of the year. So actually, I think it's going to act, you know, I know you talk about pent-up demand and us all wanting to travel, but when it comes to international travel, might this be it for the rest of the year, really, as countries just continue to put lockdowns in place to try and keep numbers low? Sorry to be negative, but it's feeling it's not a great picture now, and I know you argue for pent-up demand, but what I'm seeing seems to make me think it's hard to see where the international travel is going to come from.
Well, there is a worst case scenario, absolutely, that says that we see no significant increase, particularly in international capacity through for the rest of this year. I think, you know, there is naturally a degree of protectionist rules and regulations that are being put in place by various governments, and we've learned through the whole process that it's very, very easy to lock down, but very, very difficult to find a path out from that lockdown. You know, I drew the analogy in the summer that it's a bit like falling off the cliff. Trying to crawl back up is extremely difficult, and that's where we are. But there has to be optimism, because there are large chunks of the continents in Europe and in Africa and in South America where, you know, people cross the borders every day, Becca, and will continue to cross the borders. You can't all become an Australia or a New Zealand where you can, you know, essentially lock down. So I think that air travel demand will increase, and it's, you know, it is dependent upon vaccines. There's absolutely no doubt about it. But for some of these countries, the value of tourism to their global economy is so important that they are going to have to find ways. And we're seeing that happen in the Caribbean, where places like Antigua and other Caribbean islands have put in place excellent control mechanisms and processes to reassure travelers. So I prefer to think that, you know, the optimistic scenario is that we'll see a recovery, but it perhaps where we said it was going to be the third quarter, it might be the fourth quarter of this year.
Yes, Becca. Yeah, I agree. Yeah, John, I agree with you. I think, you know, the international travel may resume gradually in a phased manner, and the vaccine is still critically important in that whole process. I think countries around the world, particularly, for example, Australia, Chinese government, they're also looking into, country like the UK, you know, to see how effective the vaccine is. And when they have more confidence, they may gradually open up the border to those people who being vaccinated.
Yeah, I think we've had a question already from Michelle about the travel bubbles and such things, and approved destination status, the ADS program that China had. Becca, I think ultimately, you know, as we ease the restrictions, we will have a quasi ADS type structure between many countries where they will allow residents, citizens of those countries to enter, where they believe that COVID-19 is under control and the majority of the population has been vaccinated, and you have an international travel and health passport. You know, that's certainly on the agenda of many countries, and it's a reasonable request. from those countries that people arrive, I think, with a health passport.
Yeah. So ADS is approved destination status, isn't it?
Yeah, correct.
You'll see in the chat that there's opportunities to ask questions. Do ask questions as we go through. We'll try and leave time at the end for some questions as well. But we are picking up questions as we go through. So if you see anything on any of the slides, or if anything's said by John or Cheng, then please do ask if it's not clear. Let's move on and we'll look at the last 8 weeks, so slightly more recent picture of what's happening in global markets. On the left, we've got major regions, and on the right, we've got a number of major country markets. And at the bottom, the chart is just looking at China. So obviously at this point last year, John, the Chinese market had become already very affected by what was happening with COVID, hadn't it? And so when we look at a year-over-year figure now for China, we actually see something positive, because last year was the capacity was so low. But that's not the case for elsewhere at this point in time, is it?
No, absolutely. I mean, China last year, we suddenly locked down. It was about this week, and you can see from the chart, it went from probably 17.5 million seats a week down to just over 4 million seats a week. And therefore, if you compare it to this year, it looks wonderful, but the reality is it's still a very long way from its 2019 levels. But the most depressing thing, I think, Becca, about this slide, more than anything, is that if you look at some of the very large aviation markets that have, built global economies around the industry, Singapore minus 86% of its regular capacity, the United Kingdom minus 90%, and airlines in the United Kingdom, very large airlines such as Jet2 have essentially said they will not fly before the 12th of April at the earliest. And it's a worrying trend that we, for this quarter, are moving backwards. And we've seen millions of seats being stripped out of the global market from the last 2.5 months, and that trend continues. But there are one or two standouts where, the exceptions to the rule. India has, in the last 7 or 8 weeks, been very quietly adding back little bits of capacity. Very much of the majority is domestic. Mexico has never.
That's so they could all get to the cricket. I know you're
well, they would have come home early on Sunday if they were watching that cricket, I think. But Singapore, Mexico as well, where the borders have never really closed to aviation. So there are a couple of markets that have moved against the trend, but it's quite frustrating, I think. And these are big economies and big airline markets.
Yeah. So,
okay. Sorry, Becca. Yeah, just a bit explanation about traffic in China in the week of 15th of February, because that's you're seeing 170% increase of traffic compared with the same period last year. That's mainly because of Chinese New Year. This year, is falls on the 12th of February. Last year's, at the same period, China just started to lock down. So that's why you see 170% increase.
Yeah. We're going to be looking obviously at what's happened with Chinese New Year in a couple of slides ahead, because it is quite interesting. But before we do that, we just wanted to carry on looking at what's been happening to capacity over the last few weeks. And this chart on the right here shows how the global airline schedule looked in OAG's databases at different points in time. First of all, the thick dark grey line was how capacity was looking by week out to the end of March, at the beginning of the year, on the week of the 4th of January. And then each week, as we've looked at the capacity, it's been reduced for each of those weeks through to the end of March. So the thick yellow line is where we're sitting now, with it reaching a low point last week, which was in large measure a China effect, which we'll come to. It's picked up a bit this week. At the moment, it's looking like it will end the quarter a bit higher, perhaps 10% higher than it was at the start of the year. But currently, we're 11% seats below where we were at the start of the year. So that's what you're saying, John, isn't it? That it's been moving down.
It has, and to put another perspective on this, Becca, the chances, you have a 1 in 3 chance at this moment in time that if you had booked a flight in the first week of January to travel this week, that the flight would either have been cancelled or you've been reaccommodated on another service, because nearly 30, I think it's about 31% of global capacity has been stripped out since the first week of January. So, it's extremely frustrating for the airlines. And if you analyze it by each individual airline and market, you can see the changes they are having to respond to on a weekly basis. And talking to some airlines last week, they were just saying, we're changing our schedule at 2 weeks' notice because we have no clarity or visibility about what will and what will not be allowed. And another airline is just essentially running the same schedule they had nearly 330 days ago and saying we will adjust nearer the time because we haven't got a real piece of visibility about the future. And you can see in these markets here, which on the left-hand side are all pretty big. 22% of capacity was taken out of Russia. Nearly half of the capacity that intended to operate to and from Thailand removed. 30% from Brazil. I mean, it's really, really tough for everyone, and traveller confidence, which is going to be so important, is frustrated by what we're seeing here.
Yeah, definitely, and I think one of the we've got a very distinct slope on this this chart now, and I think one of the things that perhaps surprised us when we dug into it a bit more, having all I was going to say all year, but since April, May, we've been talking about at least there's domestic markets for those countries and those airlines that have strong domestic markets. There's been a little bit more resilience there, but an awful lot of this curve is, as we can see on here, is actually due to the domestic capacity weakening. So this is the same sort of approach to handling the data, but it's just domestic capacity globally. And where we had 75 million seats shown globally that have come out since the beginning of the year, this is 54 million of those are domestic. So 2/3 of the change we're seeing is domestic capacity. So that's a real change from what we've been seeing till now, isn't it? A real weakening in domestic markets.
It is, and that's a function of perhaps us having a bit more insight and trying to close down and lock down provinces and regions when a COVID spike occurs, particularly in China. We've seen that. Cheng can tell us more about how Beijing and other parts of China have been locked down during the first couple of months of this year. But similarly, Russia and Brazil and the United States are 3 of the countries that we had on the previous slide, and they are 3 of the largest domestic markets in the world. So, if they're seeing these types of capacity cuts, that Becca, then it impacts and flows through to the whole numbers. It's very frustrating for everyone.
Yes, yeah, John, you're right. Yeah, speaking of China, China so basically have managed the situation really well, but it's still a little bit fragile. Once there are some COVID cases, then you often see lockdowns. So that has happened in a number of Chinese cities since January this year.
Yeah, and so a lot of this domestic capacity, we're sort of homing in on where the real issues are. It is China, isn't it? So this is that same chart, but just for Chinese capacity, Chinese domestic capacity, and we see 25 million seats removed since the beginning of the year, so quite marked. But Cheng, some of this is due to concerns about the Chinese New Year and a sort of a going back and forth with the Chinese government, initially saying, don't travel, and then there were lockdowns and there weren't lockdowns. I think at the moment it's only Beijing that's under quarantine, isn't it? But people were advised not to travel over Chinese New Year about 3-4 weeks ago, weren't they? And that's effectively what we've seen. The airlines have responded to that.
Yes, Becca, exactly. Early, in January, lots of provisional governments in China advised, the residents not to travel across provinces, and then CAAC, Chinese Aviation Regulators, also announced that passengers can get their tickets fully refunded. So we're seeing a lot of people having canceled their travel plan for the Chinese New Year period. By the way, people in China have a 7-day national holiday, so Chinese New Year is possibly the biggest human migration on the planet. So that's very important for airlines. So where they see almost half of the profit coming from the spring festival period. And then I think around mid-January, the China CDC requested the provisional governments not to impose unnecessary restrictions to people. So, and then it's agreed, it's okay for Chinese, to travel from low risk region to low risk regions. And then, people started to travel again. But some people have decided to postpone their travel, after the Chinese New Year period. For example, like my parents, they're staying in Guangzhou. Previously they wanted to travel back to their hometown in Jiangxi, and then they just postponed to the Chinese New Year period. So I see lots of people are like that.
So what we're seeing when we look at the capacity here is that is an expectation at the moment that it's going to carry on growing to the end of March. And what's interesting here, the Chinese airlines took out 3.3 million seats last week and have added back in 3.9 million this week. So are you saying that you think there will be that travel? It's just going to be spread out over a much longer period of time. So as we go forward into the end of February and March, people will be traveling, and this capacity will stay the same. We should expect to see a big increase in capacity.
Yes, Becca, you're right. That's what we have been seeing in China. And according to a number of national surveys in China, lots of people have changed their plans. They still travel, but they may travel after the Chinese New Year period. So traditionally, as you have put it here, the Chinese New Year period across over 40-day period.
But Cheng, how sustainable is this? Because when I look at the numbers and I compare how much international capacity there is, I mean, I think it's broadly accepted that in most markets, international operations are probably 3 times more profitable than domestic services. And we know that the Chinese successfully migrated a lot of international capacity to domestic services at short notice. And in Q3, I think China Southern said that their domestic services were profitable, but the margins are wafer thin compared to their normal operating margins. And they can't sustain this level of domestic capacity. They've got to start putting capacity back into the international market. We have more and more high-speed train services in China. It's just a model that will break at some point. The pressure must be building from the airlines to start international services again.
Yes, John. You're spot on. I think that's something that the major Chinese airlines are really worried about, because domestic market is big, but it's already saturated, and also high-speed rail, has been developing very, very quickly. That has already connected all the major cities in China, and so airlines, profitability is a really big issue for them in the domestic market. And previously, the travel, the flights to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan were very profitable. Yeah, and now, I think airlines. So basically, the beach. So domestic market, provides them with some cash flow, but difficult to support their expansion, and even, to maintain their current fleet.
And
I think you referred to high-speed rail, but we
Becca,
can't
someone has made a point.
The scale of the increase in high-speed rail, can we? The network is being extended quite rapidly, isn't it? And will really eat into those domestic services over the next few years.
Yes, exactly. And I think the future for this, the biggest for Chinese Airlines, Air China, China Southern, China Eastern, and the Hainan Airlines. The future for them is more on the international market. So it's good that how we got a strong domestic market to support them, but for them to be profitable, it's in the international market.
Okay, very interesting. So obviously, the last few weeks we've seen a big reduction in capacity, and as we've seen all over the last year, when we see that big sort of change, we also see lots of cancellations. So this is data from OAG's flight status. Just over the course of the last year, the cancellation rates for flights from China, and not really surprising, but we saw a big spike in cancellations over the last month, rising as high as nearly 15%. That's quite a lot of cancellations, isn't it, John? But not always. In some ways, it sounds worse than perhaps it is. I know some of these markets, some of these routes have got very high frequencies of operations. So if you cancel some of them, there's still another plane coming along in an hour, isn't it?
Yeah, very much so. I mean, some of these are what we would consider classic shuttle type services and routes. But we must also remember the flight status data tracks the cancellation from 48 hours into the moment of departure. So, if a flight is cancelled 48 hours or 46 hours before it was scheduled to operate, then it would be recognised as a cancellation. And what we've seen, of course, is these very sudden, sharp lockdowns, not just in China, but we've seen them in Melbourne and in Auckland in the last 2 weeks, and that has an impact straight away on the level of cancellations that we see. And if you smooth that out, then you can see that cancellation rates in China from sort of beginning of August were running at about 6 or 7%, still higher than the normal rates. An airline tries to dispatch at about 98.7, I think, percent dispatch reliability, if not better. So these are extraordinarily high, but that's the world we will live in as we work through and are all released out of lockdowns. There will be more cancellations. They will be short notice. And ultimately, as travellers, we're going to have to learn to philosophically accept these short notice changes.
Yes. Be nice to fly anywhere at the moment, but yeah, I'd accept some short notice changes.
Well, I think when we first came into this, Becca, we were hearing of lots of cancellations, particularly in the US market at short notice. But essentially, the airlines were still maintaining their connectivity, and if you needed to travel from Los Angeles to New York, and you had to go via a hub and wait for 3 hours rather than 2 hours, then so be it. And there is I've done a piece of analysis for an OAG blog that will be coming out soon that highlights the risk of increased minimum connecting times on key routes, and the impact this will have on airlines will be dramatic. 1 hour connections are probably not going to be possible for a long haul to long haul flights, certainly in the short term and probably medium term. And some major traffic flows and scheduling issues are going to face airlines around the world. It's that is a piece of a logistics jigsaw that really hasn't yet been thought through, and will have dramatic implications for airlines and their fleet planning.
Yeah, so at the moment, the airlines are still trying to juggle this very dynamic situation, but you're saying that as we move through this, actually they're going to have to take a really fundamental look at their schedule and think about it in a different way with longer connecting times, different patterns of connectivity.
The quickest way from London to Sydney at the moment is with the Singapore Airlines connection of 1 hour in Singapore, and the aircraft that flies down to Sydney then returns back to Singapore after a 75-minute turnaround on a wide-bodied aircraft to connect with the premium Singapore Airlines flight from Singapore to London Heathrow. If the Australian authorities require a 2-hour turnaround, that connection is blown, and Singapore Airlines will not be able to operate onto the slot arrival they have at Heathrow. And you know, that means they'll have to either re-engineer their whole network, or they'll need to think about additional assets and how they utilize their aircraft. And that's just one example, and there are thousands of examples where we're going to see connectivity compromised as a result of increased health checks and requirements.
Maybe that's a topic for a future webinar, John. Perhaps that's something we should dig into in a bit more detail. So we were hearing from Cheng a moment ago John, that the Chinese airlines do need to expand internationally. That going forward, the domestic market won't be enough. We're going to come a bit later in the webinar to talking about what that demand is for travel by Chinese outbound travellers. But let's first have a look at some of those Chinese airlines. We've got a bit of a whole load of things on the slide here, but the chart on the left here, looking at some of the main Chinese carriers, and we look at the capacity for this week versus the comparable weeks last year and the year before, which isn't quite a fair comparison, because as we've noted, Chinese New Year fell at different points in the different years. I think it was 25th of January in 2019 and about the 5th of February last year. So slightly different timing, but it's interesting. We've got, a lot of the airlines are operating not far off the capacity they did 2 years ago. But we've got a couple, China Express and Spring Airlines, that actually are sort of, well ahead of where they were. And I think all the way through, we've been saying, in adversity, there are opportunities that some airlines, some tourist bodies, some destinations will find ways to make, find the opportunity in the situation. Cheng, do you want to tell us a bit more about China Express and Spring Airlines? What's their business model and where do they fit in here?
Okay, Becca. Yeah, China Express Airline is a regional airline specializing in connecting those small and medium-sized cities. A quite unique aspect of its business model is that the airline works quite closely with some regional governments in China. So governments buy in their capacity well in advance. So basically, China Express, they can, they have got sort of like a secured income, regardless, with or without any passengers. So when they have some additional passengers, they may be able to, sort of like even break even or make good profit. So that business model worked really well, particularly last year. And the airline, China Express airline actually ordered over 100 aircraft. So they're planning quite a rapid expansion in those regional markets in China. So that's about China Express Airlines. Spring Airlines is a low-cost carrier, and it's I think a quite unique or one of its advantage is that Spring Airlines can quickly respond to market changes. So, it quickly, cancel its flights when there are COVID cases, and it can quickly push up more capacities when the market is being reopened up. Last year, China Spring Airlines have also taken delivery of a few new aircraft. So both airlines actually, done really good job last year.
Mm-hmm. But thanks very much, Cheng. When we look at the aircraft orders, we've got some numbers there, courtesy of CAPA, for the three big carriers. There's some big aircraft order numbers, aren't there? So are those orders for domestic markets or for international markets? Where are we going to see those aircraft deployed in time?
Okay, I'm not sure whether those orders will be delivered on time. At the moment, many Chinese airlines are trying to renegotiate with Boeing, Airbus, and other manufacturers to try to delay, the delivery. And when the aircraft is delivered, let's say at the moment, then they had to be put on the domestic market. Yeah. I think the only exception is freighters. So there's a very, very strong demand for freighters in China. So, we are seeing a number of new cargo carriers were founded in China in the past few months. Yeah.
Okay, very interesting. And as we can see in this chart in the bottom right, the international capacity from China at the moment is really minimal. There's very little international flying, is there? I know we've had a few questions about, are these charts all domestic? We have included international in here, but it's very limited. What are the rules at the moment about international travel?
Okay, the international travel, I think the recovery, is still less than 10% compared with the same period in 2019. CAAC still operates quite strict, the so-called 5 1s policy. So basically, Chinese airlines can only operate one flight a week to one country. So and when the situation improves, some countries may have got 5 2s or 5 3s, but it's still very limited.
But the expectation is that there's an intention by the government to change that and to bring international travel back. Is there?
Certainly. I think the government also, the airlines are keen to change, but the government is acting very cautiously. I think the priority is make sure not to have a sort of, to create, bringing more COVID cases into country. So that's the top priority. If the government is confident they can get that under control, I think they can gradually increase, international flight frequency. We previously see the frequency increase to Japan and South Korea.
Yeah. And we've had a question in from Stephanie Haydolf. Are we seeing any new Chinese airlines arising from this crisis?
Okay, rising. Okay. For example, we see Spring Airlines. Yeah, Spring Airlines.
Are there new startups as well?
Startups. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Actually, in Hong Kong, there's a new airline called the Greater Bay Airline. Mm-hmm. So they may come up, and there are quite a few new startups in China, but they're all cargo carriers. We're seeing about at least 5 or 6 cargo startups in the past 2 months.
So cargo's the place to be. So we couldn't talk about the airlines without talking a bit about HNA, which couple of weeks ago announced bankruptcy. John, do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about HNA? Where does it fit in the landscape in China with airlines?
Well, it was the golden boy of Chinese commercial aviation for quite some time, Becca. It was a 5-star airline with a very high profile, very good service levels, positioning itself as almost a Western airline in China, with latest generation aircraft types. rapid expansion. And of course, HNA was part of a larger conglomerate of travel and industry related businesses. Very large tourism portfolio, of course, in Hainan. And it probably 6-7 years ago was rapidly acquiring catering companies, ground handling agents, paying perhaps overvalue for those assets, and has been caught out. The bubble has burst, and it was already looking like it could have overexpanded and overreached its network, and it actually probably highlights one of the greatest challenges for the Chinese airlines generally, in that international regional services for them, within 3 or 4 hours are extremely profitable. And as Cheng referenced, markets like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Thailand were very profitable, very high load factors and good yields. But they and other Chinese airlines have blown their brains out operating from China to European destinations with very low yielding traffic and many months of the year very low load factors. So it sort of almost believed its own advertising and its own rhetoric about how big and how successful it would be. So this was coming, and it's a great shame. But now, if ever, is a good time to reshape your business and adjust your network and be ready for the recovery when it begins to come. And Cheng, I think the plan is that HNA will continue to operate. It may just be slightly smaller.
Yes, John. Yeah. So basically, it's sort of like a Chinese style Chapter 11. So HNA is now restructuring and reorganizing. The group is now disposing of their non-aviation assets and more focused on the ALI business. So HNA has announced they keep all the ALIs, and the debt, may be transferred to HNA Group, and also, to the lenders. The lenders, the money they lend to HNA may be transferred into shares. So there's been a very intensive discussion between, the HNA Group and the debtor at the moment. I have no doubt that, HNA will re-emerge from the bankruptcy protection, will become a new airline, but maybe more focused on airline business.
Okay, and we'd like you to see these individual brands. They obviously operate a number of branded airlines. The chart on the left is the capacity for the current week, and we can see they're operating 8-9 different brands. Are we going to see that carry on, or will they consolidate into a single Hainan Airlines brand?
Yes, I think they'll still carry on. I think the current plan is to keep those brands, because actually many brands have got shares from regional governments, and by keeping those brands, they can maintain good connection with those regional authorities and also get their support. So within HNA Group, they're trying, they've been, even before the COVID, they've been working to coordinate the activities among the member airlines, so to try to achieve synergies. I think that's something they continue to do, after we emerge from the bankruptcy.
Okay, so it may not, in the end, we may not see too much change to the sort of aviation landscape in China.
No, not really. I think broadly speaking, there'll be the same for airline groups. I think Air China, China Southern, China Eastern, and the HNA. I think the 4 groups have more than 85% market share in China. So we won't see the big change. But some smaller airlines in China, may be merged or consolidated into one of the 4 groups.
Okay.
Yeah. But for HNA, possibly, they may restructure or may drop, some unprofitable long-haul routes. That's something we may expect.
Okay.
Chen,
So let's start.
Becca, can I ask, from an international perspective, taking that point about second tier 2 European airports that are served by Chinese airlines, we have the big 3 Chinese carriers, and perhaps Shenzhen would be included in them as well. But we're going to see a lot of flights to Europe that were operated probably not return after the lockdown has been eased. You know, it just seems to me there was too much capacity, perhaps both to Europe and to the United States. Do you think that was the case?
Yeah, I think those, many of those routes may not be sustainable after the COVID period, because the demand on those routes, even before COVID, was not particularly strong. And so airlines were suffering financially. But previously, they had profit. They can use the cost subsidize those routes. After COVID, I think airlines, had to be very, cautious, and they may, reduce the international network. I think there's something, particularly those, secondary airports in Europe, they need to be careful. That's something they need to watch carefully.
Could those routes be saved by cargo? I mean, is that an option for those airlines?
Yes, possibly. Yeah, for some select routes, for example, to Belgium, some routes, or to Amsterdam. Yeah, but Amsterdam, obviously not small; it's quite a big destination. Yeah, cargo. The demand for cargo has been very strong, China. But another positive aspect is that now many people in China prefer direct flights. Yeah, instead of transferring from major hubs. If there's sort of like a decent demand, those routes may be kept.
Mm-hmm.
So that's interesting, isn't it? Because when we've been looking at air service development from China in recent years, there has been a preference with the big 3 airlines to fly to the big hub airports in Europe. So let's move on and talk a bit about the outbound travel market, where it was before COVID and what we expect to happen now. So we had certain markets, Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, grown really rapidly. Thailand traffic had grown by 27% on average over 9 years. It had become the largest outbound travel market prior to COVID, had the highest expenditure, or the Chinese travelers had the highest expenditure of any nationality. So I guess everybody's hoping that comes back. We've seen that the airlines will want to fly internationally. We've got these slightly competing things about maybe we're not going to see as many direct services into second-tier cities in places like Europe, but actually the travelers do want to go fly direct if they can. The numbers in terms of passports say a lot. I know that prior to COVID, fewer than 10% of Chinese had a passport, but the Chinese government was issuing 10 million passports a year and encouraging people to travel, to go abroad. When I started my career, only 7% of Americans had passports, and now it's 40%. So I sometimes think, well, what happens if within a generation, 40% of Chinese people have passports, and how many travelers is that? So the numbers, in a sense, are on their side in terms of the Chinese outbound market coming back, isn't it? Is that what you see, Cheng, that Chinese travelers want to get back as much as the rest of us and visit Thailand, visit Vietnam, visit Europe?
Yes, Becca, exactly. Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, that's still very popular destinations, for Chinese travelers. And I think, even traveling to Thailand, to Vietnam, much cheaper than travel domestically, in China. And also those places have, excellent facilities and very friendly to Chinese travelers. So I think now the only issue is COVID. If those countries can get the pandemic under control, or come up with like innovative arrangements with Chinese government, we may see, a quite rapid recovery of their tourism industry.
And I think Thailand is doing quite a bit, isn't it, to try and win back those Chinese visitors. And I think you were telling us earlier, Cheng, that a holiday in Thailand is going to be perhaps a third of the price of a holiday in Hainan, which is the sort of American Florida, I guess, equivalent. Yeah. It is just you got better value when you can travel to Thailand or Vietnam from China.
Yes, yeah, and it's more value for money for Chinese travelers, and they can also experience a different culture. So I think it's still going to be very attractive to Chinese travelers, in the years to come.
John, anything to add on the Chinese outbound traveler here?
I think it's fascinating. I was seeing some stuff yesterday about the lunar holiday, the Lunar New Year, and queues in Sanya, Hainan province, at the various duty-free shops. I mean, it just struck me. There was literally, they were queuing to get into a Tiffany's store. Now, I queue and rush to get out of a Tiffany's store because they are so expensive. And it just strikes me that there is just so much demand waiting to explode back out of China. And I know there's been some numbers quoted about millions and millions of people that will Chinese outbound travelers this year. And it really, I sense that it's probably more an issue for the return back to China than it is the actual going to these destinations. That demand is there. It is under what restrictions and what requirements will you be able to return home after your holiday or vacation?
Yeah.
But it's staggering just how much demand and both how young these people are. I mean, it's a very young demographic that is eager to travel and wants to get there.
And we've got a couple of slides time. We've got some information about the sort of the type of travelers and what they're looking for. I wanted to show a slide first before we look at that. This chart shows the share of capacity that was being operated by airlines domiciled at either end of the route. Just because I guess some markets, some of the tourism markets, Australia, Japan, USA, it was mostly Chinese airlines providing the capacity between China and those markets. And so this highlights the importance, I guess, of what the Chinese airlines are able to do and when they can come back to the market, doesn't it?
It does, and some of these markets are, as you can see, almost totally reliant upon Chinese airline capacity. Australia, for instance, I mean, I think Qantas have tried before and found it really difficult to break into the Chinese market. And I think this is an important and very relevant point to the whole recovery from China, that it is going to be the Chinese international airlines that will drive the capacity and create the demand and fulfill that demand. It's going to be very hard for international carriers to begin to rebuild their presence and their networks back into China, particularly the long-haul carriers who will have been so badly damaged in the last year. So I think it's really interesting. There are just big markets, and this is without including some of the charter flights we see from China to destinations like Thailand as well, Becca. So yeah, we're all in the hands of the Chinese. They do hold the key to the recovery, no doubt about it.
So let's have a look at how a destination or tourism body might go about doing, thinking about who these travelers are. We've put this slide together, just sort of these three blocks here sort of track the change of the Chinese traveler preference. So, in the past we used to see large groups traveling, then large groups with families. What the expectation, various pieces of research we've looked at, studies, experts are saying this is more the profile, this recovery profile is what we're going to see going forward. Chinese people wanting to travel in smaller groups, perhaps family groups, private tours. So quite perhaps harder to build infrastructure around. But you know, they'll be looking to spend money, maybe spend a bit more time, get a private tour that will drive them around. We've got a guest on the webinar this afternoon who's been talking to me about Scottish Chinese groups wanting to go around in a luxury minibus with a local driver around Scotland. So somewhere outdoorsy, somewhere where they feel safe, somewhere where they can stay a bit longer, where it feels quite exclusive. So that's a big change from the sort of large groups doing inclusive packages that we saw, really not so many years ago. Cheng, is that your understanding as well of the type of profile of Chinese travelers we should expect to see after the pandemic?
Yes, Becca. Yeah, very much so, and particularly for this, young and experienced travelers. Yeah, they prefer to travel in smaller group, and basically for all travelers, safety and also hygiene will be sort of like in the top priority.
Becca, this has considerable implications for destination marketing organizations and suppliers in those markets in terms of what they offer and how they position themselves to what is the largest outbound market in the world. And that whole thing about smaller groups, private tours, exclusivity, a bit more social distancing should, if managed correctly, also provide opportunity for increased margin for the suppliers who create those bespoke products. So, if you can create a series of generic, exclusive type products that you can offer to the Chinese market that reassures them, fulfills their requirements, and most importantly, you can generate repeat custom and word of mouth, then, although 2020 has been a horrible year, the opportunities for 2021, 22 could be considerable.
I think what's interesting with the Chinese market is that if I move on to the next slide, is just how that requires being really engaged with social media and having a presence in the Chinese market, doesn't it? It's not going to be enough to say, well, I'll wait for the airlines to bring Chinese tourists to my country and then I'll do some marketing to them when they're here. That actually these are people who they've researched everything about their trip before they've visited. They may book quite late. They may actually do the booking of the travel quite late, and that what I understand is that process is getting later still. But that doesn't mean they haven't researched everything. They're not going to arrive in the UK or France and then decide to do a particular small group tour. Everything about their trip will be planned in advance, won't it? So you have to be in China using social media to keep your destination, your attraction top of mind, don't you?
You do, and I think importantly you have to work and understand the levels of confidence and trust that the traveler has in these travels or in these consumer ecosystems such as Fliggy, Ctrip, Weibo, where they literally trust everything they see in there and have huge brand loyalty. So that if you've booked your first ever travel overseas trip with Fliggy, it's probably quite likely that they will be your preferred source of booking for the next 25 years, and you will be buying other products from them as well. So it's very different to some of the travel behavior and patterns we see in other parts of the world. But it's very effective and it works very, very well. And if you can be engaged and within that travel ecosystem as a supplier, you are in a very, very good position to enjoy the rewards that are going to be coming in the next few months.
Yes, John, you're absolutely right. Yeah, I think particular live streaming has become particularly important in China, and particularly those celebrity involved and and interactive, live streaming, and they're being used as a key tool to promote tourist destinations. Yeah, and that's
Yeah,
also like a new trend we are seeing, from last year when the COVID started.
Becca, I think this is an important point as well. The point you have there about key opinion leaders, and we were saying perhaps 2 years ago, very, very important to make sure that you've got endorsement from such people. And whilst in the last year there probably has been less reliance on that particular source, I think once we come back out of lockdown and opinion leaders start traveling, they start using video and blogging and all of those things again, and they show different products and examples of social distancing and private tours and all of those sort of things, they will once again become an important source of information in the Chinese market.
Yeah, really interesting. We've got one more slide, which just takes another, looks at one specific market segment, and that's Chinese students. So there have been around 1 million Chinese studying abroad, and these are people who spend time in a country, their families often visit them while they're there, and when they go back to China, they are ambassadors for the places that they studied in. So they're a group that actually hold quite a lot of influence, I guess, in terms of developing Chinese outbound markets, don't they? And I gather the UK is gaining in popularity. The UK and Canada are gaining in popularity but until now, I think the largest number go to the US.
Well, another way to spin that, Becca, is that the UK and Canada have made less political faux pas than either the United States or Australia.
Yeah.
And that aeropolitics, soft politics, whatever you want to call it, has an influence on this as well. And the Chinese government do steer traffic to those countries where they feel diplomatic relations are better than in some other places. It's all relative, of course, because if the UK is doing better than Australia or United States, it wins for a moment. But I think, Cheng, I heard there was somewhere near 120,000 Chinese students arrived in the UK in 2020 on literally hundreds of charter flights in September and October.
Yes. Last year, I think particularly I think a couple of universities in the Greater Manchester region worked with HNA, to carry thousands of Chinese students, to North of England, And so UK actually has been very popular destination for Chinese students. I think for a number of reasons. I think one is, and particularly since last year, UK has launched a post-study visa. So Chinese students may study in the UK. After they finish the study, they can stay in the UK for a couple of years to gain work experience. And also, British pounds, being relatively low compared with the Chinese currency. So that provides additional incentive for Chinese to study in the UK.
And that's a very good point in itself. I mean, we are, we're specifically honing in on a couple of variable factors here, but the complexity of recovery, Becca, is just vast. Not only from demand, but from visas, vaccinations, lockdowns, but also currencies moving, relative purchasing power. All of these things are factors that are going to influence the recovery and where we travel to as soon as the doors are unlocked.
So it seems to sort of summarize, it seems to me that there are lots of reasons to be to be positive about the return of the Chinese outbound traveler. The Chinese airlines want to get back and have reasons to get back into international markets. Destinations want to win those Chinese travelers back. As far as I understand, the Chinese government is willing to open up. It's just timing, it's the uncertainty between, between now and then. When will it happen? When will countries feel that they can ease restrictions? Will we see sort of bilateral agreements? There's a lot to be done before that happens, but the market fundamentals in terms of demand are there.
Yeah, I mean, I've sensed in the last couple of weeks, we've probably seen a turning point in terms of confidence of a recovery. Sentiment is a bit more positive. It's just when is the doors going to be opened?
Well, thank you both very much. We've come to filled a full hour with that. We have tried to take some of your questions as we've gone through, but I'm afraid we've run out of time for additional questions now. The webinar has been recorded and will be sent to you at some point after we've finished. Thank you very much for joining us today. We'll be hosting the next webinar on the 17th of March, so 1 month's time. Please do join us then if you can. And it just remains for me to thank John and Cheng very much for joining us and for their insights today. Thank you both.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Becca.
Thanks, bye-bye.
Okay, thank you, and we'll be in touch again in a month.